Welcome to Rawcast AD. It's been quite a week. Lots to consider. Uh, I finally got the lead out of my ass and forced myself multiple days in a row. And if you've been following along or listen to my 3B, you know that it's pretty difficult for me to get a day off of work. So what I have been doing for the majority of the past week is getting my job done as quickly as I can and then making the trek over to my deceased grandmother's house to get the ball rolling. I know it's been a long time since she passed away, but about 6 months or 8 months. Wow. But no, it was finally time to not necessarily get over the grieving period. You know, there really wasn't much grieving so much as almost a perpetual state of shock over the months. But it was finally time to get things moving. We had a few loads left of things to remove from my grandmother's house, and then there was cleaning to do. But as far as on our end, in our home, it just meant that there were boxes piling up from my grandmother's house. And it really made me think about how, let's just say, mental hang-ups. So it really made me think about mental hang-ups. Like, for example, I know, again, controversial person, but Dr. Jordan B. Peterson, is it Jordan B? Dr. Jordan Peterson, he lectures people about start with cleaning your room. You know, that was an idea where like, he's got a point. You know, I'm well aware of that. A lot of times with hoarders, you've watched the shows Hoarders. You might have felt a little bit better about yourself after watching these shows. But usually it's not just that they like to collect. It's not like these people are like, I love sewing. And then they just over the years collect too much sewing shit. And then they look around and go, oh my God, what happened? I need to downsize some of this, but I love sewing so much. No, it's usually a psychological issue. And then, much as like how we feel in our minds, we kind of manifest our environments to be representations of our minds. So some of my dearest friends who, don't like having people over because their house is way too cluttered, they've got too much stuff. Ultimately, it comes from their cluttered mind. Their habitat ends up resembling what the insides of their mind, it's just, that's how it ends up being. I'm sorry I'm not explaining this in a more articulate fashion. But that's kind of how it was feeling on my end. For, personally, it's like if you don't address your problems, they don't go away. You can sweep as much under the rug as you want, but eventually you're going to notice that rug is a lot taller because you swept too much shit underneath it. So, I finally got myself cleaning out my grandma's house, and man, I didn't realize how emotionally it felt like a punch to the gut walking through that house and seeing it empty. That was, as I've said before, that was like my safe haven. That's where I could go talk to one of the most real people I've ever met in my entire life thus far. And what I didn't anticipate was that the more empty her home got, the more cluttered mine got, and the worse I would feel. And so, step one was packing up this stuff and getting it out of the house. Took all of her clothes to Goodwill. And then now that it's completely empty, just waiting on the attorney to finish the paperwork, and, charging way too much fucking money for somebody who didn't have much to pass it on, you know. Got to go through all the fucking legal paperwork, and then, you know, despite the fact that all they do is write up a document once in a while, you know, that somehow costs $3,900. Lick the dark side of my asshole, attorney, no name. I'm not at risk of her hearing this, but still don't want to, you know, out the person. But so, yeah, I mean, just knowing that this stuff was piling up in my basement and in my garage, I was just feeling worse and worse because this wasn't a problem that I wanted to deal with. You know, it's in a sad way, it was almost like by not emptying out the house, it was like preserving her memory physically in this world. But even though I never really took the time to properly grieve in a healthy way, it's got to get done. And so if you don't get over these mental hang-ups, if you don't work through these mental hang-ups, you're just going to allow your problems to fester. And so, yeah, step one of the struggle was emptying out the house, and then now it's a matter of going through and organizing this, you know, sorting through things, you know, incorporating the things that we could use in our own home. You know, you can't see it because this is audio only, and even on my three bitches, the camera's pointed the other way, but I got some of her decorations hung up in the studio. So, I mean, it's a good way to keep the fond memories. But it's time to attack those boxes. The more those boxes pile up, the worse I feel, because not only is it cluttering up my space and almost causing a bit of panic because I'm pushing the problems off. I'm brushing it under the rug. But at the same time, it's me refusing to accept the fact that she is gone from this world, this plane of existence. And so I have to remember that though it was my grandma's stuff, it's just stuff. You know? And so even though I'm talking about a subject that is fairly heavy for me, being the first major loss, you know, the last major loss in the family was when I was too young to even understand the concept of mortality. So I'd say that was a pretty goddamn good run. But after going through about a third of the boxes, you know, stuff to Goodwill, stuff that will be used in the garage, stuff that will be used someday, but just don't have the space for it now, got packed up and put into the attic. But I mean, it's a freeing experience. It's kind of like I'm clipping the bonds that are holding me back from working through these issues, you know, of loss and almost denying the reality of the situation. And so actually, yeah. Is it bittersweet? You bet your ass it's bittersweet. But with every box that I go through and, you know, Jess doesn't curl her hair, so do we need 4 curling irons? No. That's, you know, that's getting pitched. We don't need curling irons from the 80s. Just saying. But so it's not necessarily uplifting, but in a way I'm making my peace with it. And so with every box that we go through, it's a little bit less clutter, a little more space. And space is absolutely fucking important when it comes to your mental well-being. You don't want to feel boxed in. This isn't necessarily to say, you know, you don't want to trigger claustrophobia, but there is something healing about downsizing, decluttering, organizing, and cleaning. These are like physical representations that will heal the mind depending upon the issues that you are dealing with. And so I'm feeling a bit better, folks. At least with this problem. There's always going to be more problems. There's always going to be more work to do. The to-do list, unless you're grinding it out day in, day out, the to-do list is always going to get more things tacked on at the bottom. That's not to say that you should roll up your sleeves and devote every second of every day to tackling that to-do list, unless that to-do list is actually bringing you joy, to some degree. And for me, it's not joyful, but it's shit that needs to get done, because once all my grandmother's stuff is sorted, organized, redistributed, out of the way, that frees up the space for me to do the things that I want/need to get done. I need my garage so I can change my oil, change my brakes. That's necessary. Like, am I grateful that my tool collection has more than doubled? Yes, but now I got to find a way to organize it. And that's going to be hanging in the back of my mind until I actually get all of the tools organized. So, it's not necessarily out of the frying pan and into the fire. It's still an incremental step towards a more satisfying achievement of having things organized, so when you need them, you're not flailing around and wasting time looking for shit that would be where it needs to be if you bother to take the time to tackle the issue. Grab the bull by the horns, man. And so it's, as you can tell from how I keep tripping up or talking in circles, I'm still dealing with it. I feel a little less tension in my shoulders, but at the same time, there's a little more sorrow. I'm not in a position where I can take time off of work and really go center myself and be at peace. I'm not going to be taking trips to India to meet with gurus and whatnot to really dive deep into the mind. But since I brought that up, what kind of helped me get to this point where it was like, you know what, it's time to just start chipping away at this fucking block of ice that's just freezing me up completely in the matters of the mind. And so it's, I had talked about Midnight Gospel, I believe on 2 episodes ago, and then Jess and I also talked about it briefly on an episode of My 3B. But I'm ultimately, I would say I'm a fan of Duncan Trussell, and I like what he and Pendleton Ward did with the show The Midnight Gospel. And I used to be a big Joe Rogan fan. When he had comedians on, it was a chance to laugh and hear them talk about their open-minded views and the defense of the freedom of speech, that, comedians are being attacked because if you're not woke, you're going to deal with a lot of resistance from keyboard warriors and virtue signalers across the internet. But then I've much more than when he had comedians on. I enjoyed when he would bring in the scholars, the scientists, the professors, because those were the opportunities to learn. And let's be real. It's not necessarily that I'm a big fan of Joe Rogan, but the types of people that he brings in. Like I really loved listening to Paul Stamets talking about mushrooms. Like that sparked an interest in me to go foraging for mushrooms. We're not talking psilocybin. We're talking about The fact that where I go hunting, the 40 acres, I usually see hundreds and hundreds of mushrooms every October. And why the fuck with me having a garden and wanting to grow my own food and being pissed off that I'm not allowed to have chickens where I live, but wanting to be more natural with that kind of thing. I've said I don't want my food to come out of a box. I'd rather it come out of the ground. Mushrooms come out of the ground. So like Paul Stamets really sparked my interest to start learning to identify what's safe to eat. And that's just one example, but I especially loved the episodes of Joe Rogan when he had Duncan Trussell on. But more and more, Joe Rogan's like embracing this kind of alt-right mentality, which all the power to him. I'm not faulting him for that. But instead of going along for the ride when Duncan Trussell was coming on in the more recent episodes, it seemed almost like Joe was shitting on Duncan and just completely disregarding the things that Duncan had to talk about. And so I don't know why it took me this long to sit down and do this, but I finally started listening to the Duncan Trussell Family Hour. And that's Duncan's podcast where they spend most episodes. I've already listened to 3 or 4 episodes, and the majority of them deal with issues of the mind, mindfulness, meditation, dealing with death, talking about the psychological topics related to sex. It's why the fuck I would wait for episodes of Joe Rogan with Duncan Trussell or having psychologists on there to talk to Joe Rogan is beyond me, because I'm not somebody that's going to sit down and listen to every single episode of the Joe Rogan Experience. I'm going to cherry pick, and so now I still get the notifications every time Joe Rogan puts up a new podcast, but more and more I'm checking the description to see who's on, and if I don't know who that person is, I continue reading the description to see what they're about. What is their line of work? What's their research? What are they there to talk about? And so, for the most part, goodbye Joe Rogan. He's not going to be hurt that one of his 9 million listeners aren't tuning in anymore. But I'm finding that the Duncan Trussell Family Hour is a much better use of my time. And so it really started making me think. And in one of the episodes I just listened to today, as I was going through these boxes from my grandmother's house, Duncan actually talked about, decluttering the space you inhabit and how just that simple action can free the mind. And I'm like, yeah, it's kind of creepy. If this wasn't a pre-recorded podcast, I think he was talking about me, because that is what I was doing at the time. I didn't even to record episodes of Rawcast or My 3B, I had to come down the stairs and then weave my way through these stacks and stacks of boxes full of a dead person's items or possessions. And that's not healthy. On my way to the studio, I don't want a reminder that I'm sweeping my problems under the rug. And so it feels like it aged me a little bit. But I've got Duncan Trussell to kind of soothe my worries, educate me, expand my horizons, to continue this interest. As you've heard in previous episodes, my friend Jordan Dennison, who went to school for psychology, I finally got out of my own way and realized that I couldn't continue just trying to sit in my head and figure all this shit out. I had to start talking to people who actually knew and or cared, because people like to make decisions based on the information that they have, their own personal experiences. And with a lot of my family members, the discussion of mental health was one of those things where you just don't. If somebody brings it up, you just make a wisecrack, or you say something dismissive. And so, I finally, I go back and listen to a few episodes. You'll know what I'm saying. But so I finally asked a fucking psychologist to point me in the direction in lieu of therapy. And so I started listening to books written by psychologists, and like it allowed me to get a glimpse of other people's issues that they were working through with the help of these psychologists. And so I was able then to reflect that back on myself and really ruminate on the things that I was learning about these other case studies. Not necessarily case studies, but you know what I mean. And with that, it's not necessarily that I just want to learn about psychology. Like, yes, that obviously that's a huge part of this, is the more I can educate myself on clinical psychology, the better I'm able to deal with my own issues, work through my own issues, and come out the other side being a little bit better because of it. But there's also a spiritual side of it. It's not that, it's not a come to Jesus moment necessarily, but it's like recognizing that the more spiritual activities, such as like meditation or reading up on Buddhism, you can understand like how these other things, these other adventures in psychology or adjacent to psychology can be very beneficial. So even yoga, very much spiritual, but it also does wonders for the mind and the body. And so I'm not saying I'm doing yoga. My fat ass ain't doing that yet. I should be doing yoga and or Pilates. I've got a hip that needs to get some work. Not saying I need surgery, but if I don't do something, by the time I'm 50, I'm going to be walking with a limp and a cane due to my job. But it's just, I feel like it would be great if I could share these things with somebody, like as I'm learning them, to be able to talk about this stuff with somebody. But those types of people are so few and far between, and the one or two people I know that are hip to it, I don't want to be that obnoxious friend that's constantly calling you, messaging you, showing up at your door to be like, let's chat. So, I also got, just in listening to the Duncan Trussell Family Hour today, I got a little more insight. I was listening to, as Duncan calls him, his teacher. Who was it? Raghu Marcus, I believe. It's Duncan Trussell Family Hour number 272 that came out sometime this last week. And there was something in there that Raghu said about religion, where all religions kind of irk him out, because essentially each religion basically tries to focus too much on a single truth, and then they act like they have all truths figured out because they had a singular focus of truth. And there are too many universes and too many truths for any one religion to have it figured out based on their singular focus. And I really liked that idea, because I'm somebody that was raised Christian. I was forced to go through confirmation. And I found myself sitting in these confirmation classes, challenging the Christian beliefs, asking the pastor all kinds of questions. And it did get to a point where the pastor said, it might be a little late through your confirmation, but you might need to think real hard about whether or not this is something you want to do. And I thought, oh, holy shit. I mean, in retrospect, the pastor was, being real with me. But at the time, it was like, is this something that does the shepherd really just ask the sheep if this is something they want to do? Like, do you want to be part of the flock? And I felt like there were too many contradictions and hypocrisies built into the Christian belief system, and it wasn't for me. And so I spent the later teenage years of my life railing against Christianity. In college, I took religious studies classes, and even then I wasn't 100% satisfied. Like, we talked about 2 or 3 different sects of Hinduism. We talked about the 3 sects of Islam. So you've got the... now I'm getting all words mixed up in my head. I can't even remember them now. That is ridiculous. I just outed myself. But yeah, there are 3 sects to Islam, and then there's we talked about Jainism, touched briefly on Buddhism. It was great. I mean, they had us read for one of the sects of for Hinduism in general, we had to read the Ramayana. And I mean, it was very different. I still have my copy of the Ramayana right now, and I guarantee you if I read it now, which would be 13 years after I was forced to read it as a teenager, I would look at it quite a bit differently. But then we did touch briefly on Buddhism, so I had to read the Compassionate Teachings of the Divine Buddha. I think it was the Divine Buddha. But it was interesting to go ahead and, learn about these other religions, but then they didn't go far enough for me because I wanted to, technically these religious studies classes fell under the philosophy major. And if we were basically talking about the religious studies, I wanted to get into some of the life philosophies that didn't technically qualify as religions. And so, Sunni, Shia, and then I can't remember the third one that they don't talk about much. What is it? Because, if you're learning about Islam, they basically focus on the Sunni-Shia struggle for power. But when I was in college, we had to pick one of the 3 sects and basically do a report on them. And so I picked the one that were not heard of as much. And apparently to this day, there's still not much that's known about them. I wish I could remember the name of the third one. But basically, the majority of the information that I could find about the third sect of Islam was that these people like to use psychedelics. They like to drug themselves up and dance in circles. And there's more ceremony to it, but I can't remember it off the top of my head, and I'm very sorry. I want to see if... Well, that's not the other one. Huh. Google is failing me. But either way, so I was fascinated, so I was learning about Islam around the time that there was Islamophobia happening in the United States because we were still dealing with um, the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, Christ, we still got people in Afghanistan, but what I mean is it was much more prevalent. It was in the news. Like, you were hearing about people shooting up mosques and shit like that. It was really fucked up. Like, even for my religious studies class, we had to take a trip to a mosque, and it was one of the most enlightening experiences of my life. It was like, and I grew up in a fucking Christian church. And so, like, at 18 years old, visiting a mosque and being treated with respect and, talking to these people and realizing that they're really not that much different. They just have a different belief system religiously, spiritually. And the fact that at the end of the day, the Christian God and the Islamic God are the same fucking God, and why there was so much divisiveness, why like Christians despised mosques being built in their towns and shit like that was beyond me. I couldn't understand the hatred. I was like, have you taken the time to sit down and break bread with these people? And so, I mean, it was paying attention to the culture clashes as I was reading about these other cultures and other religions was just fascinating to me. But like I said, I wanted to expand my horizons to not necessarily go on focusing on a single religion each month. I wanted to look at life philosophies that didn't necessarily qualify as religions. So on my own, because they wouldn't teach us in the religious studies class, I got a hold of a copy of Anton Szandor LaVey's The Satanic Bible. And so I read that. And I mean, oh my God, I was ostracized by some of the people living in the dorms with me because I shouldn't even have a copy of that. But that's just fucking ridiculous. Just because you're aware that it's not your particular belief system doesn't mean that it's inherently evil and that it shouldn't be read. The best way to figure out the truth about your enemy is to learn about them. And so, Buddhism, Jainism, Islam, we didn't focus on Christianity because that was a fucking given. But then, the satanic philosophy by Anton Szandor LaVey, I was reading up on. And this was all fascinating stuff. Like, I enjoyed learning about it. Like, the two topics that you shouldn't talk about publicly, in the workspace, politics and religion. So naturally, for the last 10 years of my life, politics and religion were like my favorite topics of discussion because fuck me, right? But so like, I felt like a lot of these religions had the same core principle, which, was basically peace and being a good person. But that wasn't enough for me. And then researching all of these other religions, I felt like they all had their good points, but none of them answered the questions that I needed answering, and that basically diving in and taking a single religion hook, line, and sinker wasn't enough for me. Like, it's just that I was always going to have issues with some of the things that were going on with any one given religion. And so it was just really nice to listen to Duncan Trussell Family Hour and hear Raghu say that, like, he thinks that all religions are essentially bullshit because they're of their like narrow-minded singular focus. Like, they latch on to a single truth, and then they have to declare to the universe that they are the ones that have the truth, the all-encompassing truth. And it's not true, because each religion has a truth, and their own truth isn't the all-encompassing, all-powerful truth. They all have truths, but none of them have the greatest truth. And does the greatest truth even necessarily exist? I don't fucking know. So I'm not going to declare for any one religion, because religion doesn't answer the questions that I need. It doesn't scratch the itch. I'm super itchy, but no one of you is going to be able to cover the full scratch that's needed. And so, yeah, I didn't have a healthy way to grieve the loss of my grandmother, who I absolutely fucking adored. That little battle axe bitch, I miss you. And if she heard me say she was a battle axe bitch, she would just laugh and light a cigarette. But, for some people, going to church, turning to Jesus, that's how they're able to face their own issues with death anxiety or mortality directly, and like that soothes their soul enough that they're able to get out of bed the next day. But I knew that after the years of reading up and studying these other religions, that none of them were going to have the answers that I needed. But in going forward, the best thing that I can do for myself is continue to listen to a variety of spiritual scholars and clinical psychologists, and along my journey kind of accumulate this amorphous understanding of not only myself, but of how to accept things as they are in a successful manner that also allows me to not become a bitter shell of a human being by the time I reach my deathbed. And so I guess I don't know what the entire point of this particular episode was, other than to get some of this shit off my mind and say that I am having a much more enjoyable time listening to the Duncan Trussell Family Hour and audiobooks by clinical psychologists than I ever have listening to an episode of Joe Rogan. And so if you haven't had the experience of listening to a Duncan Trussell podcast, though you are somebody who enjoys podcasts or you enjoy reading up on psychology, whether it's just an interest in the workings of the human mind or dealing with your own psychological issues, check it out. Pull up YouTube and type in Duncan Trussell Family Hour. To me, it's well worth it. And if you'll excuse me, I need to go make dinner and throw on the cans to listen to another episode of Duncan Trussell Family Hour. Much love to my Rawcast listeners. I hope you're all doing well. There's still a lot of crazy in this world. COVID's getting nuts. We have somebody in the White House who has never been told no and doesn't understand what it is to lose because they've only ever failed upward. And how do you fail upward from being the president of the United States? I don't know. But sounds to me like he should lay off the Diet Coke and do some ruminating, some meditation, and try to find a way to ease up on the resistance so that he himself can find some acceptance. Accept the truth. Accept reality for what it is. A lot of us need to be able to do that. It's not a matter of getting away from our reality to find peace, because peace isn't outside of us. Peace isn't out there. We have to make peace within. And that's the important part. So, all the best to anybody listening to this. Go forth in peace. As you can tell, I don't know how to end this. Goodbye.